Hey everyone, and welcome back to our series on indoor photos. If you've ever taken photos indoors, you know that it can be tricky. Oftentimes we don't have the light that we are hoping for. We may not have the space that we're hoping for. We may have to use camera settings that we wouldn't typically use. So that's why we're doing this series, to talk through different ways that you can shoot indoors while embracing all of those things. So in this series, we are not talking about utilizing flash or strobes. We are talking about shooting indoors and utilizing the natural light around you in the best way possible. So we're going to be talking about things like window light and shooting in tight spaces. What type of gear do you need? How do you shoot in low light? What about noise and grain? How do I avoid it? How do I embrace it? Those are all things we're going to be talking about in this series. But in this video, we're going to be talking about shooting in low light. So this was something that was very pivotal for me early in my photography. When I first started taking photos and learning how to shoot in manual mode with a DSLR camera, I lived in a very small, dark home just outside of Chicago with a long winter. Means I had a lot of time to practice taking photos inside. And one of the things that was really interesting to me and that I just kind of grabbed onto was taking photos in low light. And I would practice, I would utilize specific things just to see, like, how, if I do this, how does that affect my ISO? If I do this, how does that affect my ability to focus? If I do this, how does that affect the grain that is in my final image? What can I use for a light source? What should I not use for a light source? What difference does it make if I bring this into the frame or not? It was just very fascinating to me. It was something that I really, really enjoyed, and I took as a personal challenge to make myself better. And so you'll see that the images here are of my kids, and they are images that I took literally as a part of this personal challenge to understand low light and to learn how to work with it, because it was something I didn't want that to be an excuse or a reason why I didn't take photos in my dark Chicago home. So I'm going to walk you through. Now you'll see here, I actually just realized this, the first half of my photos are of my kids sleeping. That was always a unique time that I was able to literally have really, really dark areas, and I could play with the light source. So bear with me, it's kind of funny. So here, this image was taken in a very dark room. You can tell that by the shadows around, but you'll see that there's a pretty significant light source right there on his face. And that is actually a light from, I believe it was a bathroom. It might have been a closet, directly to the left out of the frame a little ways. And I knew that I wanted to take this photo. He looks so sweet laying there. And so I thought about what I had around me that I could use for a light source and utilize that. But that's not always the only thing we have to think about, right? Like, you can tell, if you look at this image, like, you can tell, like, there is still some grain here, right? And we're going to talk about grain in another video. I am not one to really freak out about grain, and it's something that I think too many of us freak out way too much over. But we're going to talk about that in a separate video. But if you've ever tried to take photos in really low light, you know that one of the hardest things can be to get your camera to focus. And that was something I didn't realize. And so I began to experiment with utilizing different types of light sources to be able to have enough light so that I could properly focus an image. So I began to experiment with things like flipping on a closet light, flipping on a bathroom light. I'll show you a couple of other things that I did here, using creative light. So here we're talking about low light, but I'm also going to be talking about creatively using the light that you have. And these are all very dramatic examples. Like, I think every single photo in this series that I'm going to show you are taken in a pitch black room, like literally pitch black. So this is like the extreme of low light. But I will also show you in another video at another time about taking portraits when you don't quite have enough like sunlight or whatever that might be, because there are other things that you want to do there. So when I'm choosing how I'm going to set my camera up, what settings am I going to use, what kind of light am I going to have, the first thing I do is I look for what light do I have available and how can I make it pointed towards my subject, whether it's like using mirrors or whatever it might be. So always be looking around you for a light source, always, and place your subject as close to it as you possibly can. Now here my subject is sleeping. My subject was not going to move. But you may not be photographing a sleeping child. You might be photographing clients in their home on a dark, dreary day. So think about how you position them to the light source. And then I want you to think about what is the minimum shutter speed that you need in order to get a sharp photo. Typically, if you're hand holding your camera, it's pretty dangerous to go below like 1/120th of a second. Now, some people will go lower than that. I am personally not comfortable with that because I feel like too many of us move and we don't even realize it. And you get a little bit of camera shake, and just that tiny little bit, if you don't have a fast shutter, can make your images blurry. So it's very rare that I will go below 1/200th of a second ever. But if I'm in an extremely dark room or situation, then I may lower my shutter speed a little bit more than that. And then I want you to open up your aperture nice and wide. Now here, these are all photos of like 1 or 2 people. So I'm able to use a wide open aperture. You may not be able to do that if you were photographing a group of people or a bunch of people in a group setting, or maybe it's, a varied pose where you've got people on all different focal planes. You may not have that option. So I want you to open up your aperture as wide as you can for the context you are in. And then from there, once you've got your shutter speed at the lowest safe place and your aperture at the widest safe place, then you turn up your ISO to as high as you need it to go. And we don't freak out about high ISO. We don't freak out about having grain in our image because that's okay. It is more important, and we'll talk about this in a separate video in further detail, but it is more important that you expose your photo properly in camera than it is to keep your ISO low. So you do whatever you have to do with your ISO to get the image exposed. So now that we've talked through all of that, I'm just going to show you some examples of ways that I utilized light. We already talked here through this one. In this next photo, I utilized a lamp sitting off to the side to get the photo that I wanted. So again, I'm experimenting. This was all part of my experimentation. I'm trying to learn how to work with low light, how to work with unique lighting sources, how to embrace that grain, how to crank up my ISO, what should my settings be. And here, I found that it was a little bit easier to focus for this photo because I had more contrast than in this photo. Here I've got the light coming in, but it was much softer. It wasn't as contrasty, but here, because of the angle of the light and the type of light, there was more contrast, and that gave me something to, for my focus to grab onto right here on the eyes where I was wanting to focus. Same thing here, kids hanging out in bed, utilizing light from the bathroom. And then here we have light coming in. This is actually from a window. And in this situation, this was another context where the room was really, really dark. It was nighttime. There was a street light right outside this window. And so the light that was coming in as that light was lit was very unique. And by positioning him right in the right place, I was able to focus right there on his eyelashes, get this really neat contrasty photo, and get a really, really beautiful image. I'm going to hop over to this one. So in these next couple of photos, I just wanted to show you some examples of ways that I have used creative light sources to get really neat photos. Again, when I was taking these photos, I was kind of giving myself this personal challenge to really embrace low light, to really embrace looking for unique light sources, not being afraid of taking photos when it was dark. And so I began looking in all different places for this unique concept of like light that I may not have ever really seen or thought about before. So here, my kids were hanging out. They're actually on the couch. You can't tell that here. They were on the couch and they were watching, I believe they're looking at an iPad, and it had gotten really dark outside, and literally the only light in the room when I came back in from my bedroom was the light from the iPad. And it was really cool to see just kind of this unique light on them. Everything around them was dark, and I grabbed my camera again. Perfect example of unique light sources, just expanding my personal creativity and helping me practice looking for light in unique places. Another example is here. My daughter had a habit of right around bedtime, she wanted to go to the fridge, she wanted to get the milk and have a cup of milk. And on this particular day, it was nice and dark. She didn't flip on the kitchen light, and I happened to have my camera over on the kitchen table, grabbed it, and got this really cool photo of just like a neat kind of thing that she was always doing. So again, really unique light source. I would have never thought to take a photo using refrigerator light, but here we are. So always think about unique and creative ways that you can find light in places that you may not have thought of before. And then in this final example, this is my son. He's playing with a lantern, and it was really cool the way that the light was casting unique shadows all around the room. He was like mesmerized by it. But what I was mesmerized by was the way that the light was hitting his face and the dramatic shadows that were around him. So again, utilizing unique light sources, paying attention to the lights and the shadows and things that you may not have otherwise noticed that can give you light when you are taking photos in a situation where you don't have a lot of it. So keep in mind, the gear that you use is important. We're going to talk about that in another video. The camera settings that you use are important. We talked briefly about that, about how to choose your camera settings, how to use the widest aperture, how to use the safest low shutter speed that you can, and then turning up that ISO. So you're probably wondering what that means for grain and noise in your photo. So we are going to talk about that in another video in this series. But for now, I want you to go look around and try to find some unique light sources that maybe you didn't notice before, maybe you haven't tried to shoot with before, something outside of maybe what might be a normal, typical light source. And I want to challenge you to push your creativity out of the box just a little bit and start to really embrace that low light.